The French Revolution is one of the most interesting times in human history. Up till that point, the few ruled the many. The king used to have the concept of divine right benefiting him. It is that God created France, and God anointed the king in order to rule over everything that is in France. And that was the political system. That was the case until the people rose up and overthrew the king. So this causes a problem. What new political system should be enacted now that their entire way of life was uprooted? And the new political system was democracy. You see, the French were championing liberté, égalité, fraternité. All of these three slogans gave birth to new movements. Liberté gave birth to liberalism. Fraternité gave birth to fascism, and égalité gave birth to communism. But that's a story for another time. What is interesting here, however, is that after they have executed the king, they have enacted something that historians will call the terror. The terror started when the figurehead of the revolution, Robespierre, said that terror is now the rule of the day. Terror meant that in France, there are still loyalists to the king. There are still counter-revolutionaries, and they must be punished. And as such, the enemy was within. So the French people started turning on each other. Neighbors began turning on each other. Anyone that was viewed as being against the new system was guillotined. For you see, the guillotine was a new invention. Up until that time, executions were quite brutal, but the guillotine was promising a humane way, a decent way that civilized people like to solve the problems in their nation. And as such, the guillotine kept swinging over and over and over. It is reported that around 40,000 people have died during the Great Terror. And this is interesting because the population at that time was a lot smaller than it is now. So while 40,000 is a significant number, it cannot describe just how impressive it is for that time period. So why were people guillotined? Well, in the beginning, it started with genuine offenses. Aristocrats that were indeed counter-revolutionaries were taken to the guillotine. But after a while, even people who were misgendering would be guillotined. And I know what you're asking, like, what do you mean misgendering? Because that is a new concept. Well, at the time, if you called someone mademoiselle or monsieur, well, you were a problem because you were supposed to address people with citizen. The calendar was changed because the names of the months, January, February, March, and so on, were coming from Catholicism, or so they believed. And as such, they had to change into different months' names. And using the previous ones, even in mistake, could get you guillotined. Things that you have said even before the revolution could get you guillotined. This is why it was called the Great Terror. A cult of reasoning was in place, where atheism became the norm. People who were religious or found to be religious risked getting guillotined. And it all culminated with the prospect of destroying France's past, because the past was evil, and only by destroying the past can people move forward. Now I will leave you to draw the parallels, if you can, with the political situations in modern time today, where, we have a more humane method than using the guillotine, and that is of just nullifying people. It's how the Romanian call cancel culture. They call it nullifying culture, where you take a person and you nullify them to the point where they can't hold a job, they can't have an online presence, they have been nulled. They are a nobody. Of course, we are lucky to live in more civilized times where the guillotine isn't necessary, but the damage that is done to certain people who are unable to feed themselves or their family without getting a due process and a fair trial deserves to be mentioned. Now, I thought a little bit, and when I got this meme, I found it very hilarious and interesting. Because if we were to compare, at least metaphorically, the cultural revolution that takes place right now with the one in France, instead of liberté, fraternité, égalité, I guess we could use diversity, equity, and inclusion. These seems to be the mantra, the unquestionable tenets that a new ideology forming in the West seems to have. So let's analyze them a little bit, because just like liberté, fraternité, égalité meant other things than what they were claiming to mean, these slogans, in my opinion, have completely different meaning than they originally appear. All of them seem to be Mott and Bailey's. When you criticize the concept, well, they withdraw their meaning to mean something beautiful. And when you're not criticizing, they expand their meaning in order to mean something ugly. For example, diversity. It's a very beautiful concept, and it originally started, I think, after the Occupy Wall Street period, when you saw in newspaper the idea that having diverse people tackling an idea means that you are going to get more solutions, and as such, you can pick the right solution for the problem. So obviously, it's a good thing. Like, diverse people can tackle an idea from different points of view. However, when the chief diversity at Apple had the audacity to express her own opinions, we noticed that the mask has slipped. She claimed that 7 people in a room that are white with blue eyes and blonde can be diverse because those people can come from different backgrounds and thus have different lived experiences. But because she said that, she was forced to apologize. And we know what happens to people who apologize, don't we? They get fired. That is right. And that signifies that diversity is not diversity of ideas, but instead it's diversity of arbitrary characteristics. And even if you are a proponent of such a thing, you have to come to terms with the fact that diversity officers do not actually increase diversities, or at least this is what studies show. Because if you think about it, if diversity officers would actually manage to solve the problem with the lack of diversity, then their job wouldn't be needed, and they are paid very well in order to constantly justify their existence. As such, the question begins, what do they do? Well, much like a Soviet commissar, they are there in order to make sure that people think the correct thoughts. We're not talking about people doing the correct actions, but we are talking about people thinking the correct things, saying this proper speech. That is what a diversity officer is supposed to do, which explains why the Apple diversity officer was fired, because she wasn't doing her job. And her job wasn't to make sure that Apple has diversity. Her job was to make sure that the people at Apple think the correct things. In other words, every single major institution which has diversity officers makes sure that this revolutionary ideology is being promoted within their companies. And it makes sure that only the people who are part of this ideology get to have a cushy job. Everyone else has to suffer. Well, I guess they always have the mom and pop stores, which, oh, oops, they're closed right now, aren't they? The second thing is equity, and equity is something that I found to be very interesting, because in the beginning it was equality. A lot of newspapers and progressive media outlets were championing the concept of equality, until it was blatantly obvious that there was one rule for a group and another for a different group. And equality could no longer stand, and they fixed it with equity. So what is equity? Well, equity is when you notice that society treats you differently, and you suspect that they treat you differently because of your arbitrary characteristics, then you're right. The reason, for example, the employees at Coca-Cola were told to be quote-unquote less white, which is completely outrageous, and if you replace white with anything else, it would definitely warrant a lawsuit, is because of ancestral guilt and collective punishment. You see, because some white people are bad, then clearly all are bad. This broad generalization based on arbitrary characteristic is now okay, even though it wasn't okay 5 years ago. And it's only okay under certain circumstances and depending on who you target. A statement can be okay in one situation, but be very problematic in another. As for the ancestral guilt, well, the ancestors of white people did horrible things, and as such, the suffering of the employees at Coca-Cola is now justified. And only through their suffering can we achieve the greater good. There is no other way. And finally, we have my personal favorite, inclusion. Now, if you happen to read the papers or you notice what corporations are putting out as statements, every single time the word inclusion is being mentioned is when someone gets fired or someone gets excluded. But this is by design. You see, the idea is that everything is political, and as such, just like in a fascist regime, corporations have to work for the greater good of society. They shouldn't work for their shareholders, they should work for their stakeholders. Stakeholders meaning everyone that's a customer, everyone that uses the company. In other words, companies like Hasbro aren't just producing entertainment, they become communities. And in these communities, everyone should be included. However, the problem is that as wherever you go, you may find racists, fascists, or other undesirable people. And their very existence causes exclusion. Because a racist exists at the board game table, that means that other savory people who would like to play the board game would not enter because they viewed the stain of racism to be abhorrent and they do not want to be in the same building with a racist. And of course, it should be a numbers game. If we exclude the racist, like Archie Warhammer, you bloop him away from the table, then the swaths of masses can finally go in and they can enjoy themselves. As such, it is the duty of every single company and corporation to actively seek out these dissidents and make sure that their place is filled with purity. They need to exclude these people in order to have inclusion. And of course, when you look at the people getting excluded, it did start off with racists and actual problematic people, but then you end up with just average Joes that seem to have different opinions. Much like the people guillotined in the French Revolution towards its middle and the end, just people who misgendered or people who had various thoughts while drinking in a tavern. I hope you enjoyed this video and let me know what you think.